Ek begin die recording. Daar's 'n recording is started. Louis, jy kan laat waai.
Okay, here we go. En ek wil nou sommer ek het my seun Stefan uitgenooi. So hy sit ook 'n bietjie en luister vanaand. So dankie daar so. Welkom. Right, so we're going to talk about electromagnetic wave propagation. I changed the title a bit because it's a bit more descriptive. So despite what we ever try with all our antennas and transmitters and so on, nature always throws a curveball to us, and as you'll see tonight, it's not always so easy to obtain a good transmission over long distances and even over short distances. It all depends on the weather, atmospheric conditions, and the sun. So these are the two main aspects we'll discuss tonight. So we start propagation, and what I'll do tonight is it's a quite a long chapter, a lot of detail. So I made slides of only the essential parts, and we'll read as we go along. So have your text with you, and we start at page 252, point 27.1, and we'll work from there. So first off, propagation is the process by which radio waves get or move from the antenna of a transmitter to the antenna of a distant receiver, and vice versa, of course. Now you'll see here in the table on the 27.1 is the frequency bands. Just there's a mistake there. On the left set of corners, there's wavelength from and to 3 megahertz to 30. It must be frequency, as you'll see here on my table on the screen. So just swap those two around. So mostly we work with HF, which we call high frequency, which ranges from 3 to 30 megahertz or 100 to 10 meters. And the amateur bands are more or less in the 80 to 10 meter bands. There's 9 specific bands where we can work. Then VHF, which is very high frequency, up from 30 megahertz, and then from 30 megahertz up to 300 megahertz. And that's the wavelengths are 10 to 1 meters, and more specifically, we mostly work on 6 meters and 2 meters, as we all know very familiarly. Then ultra high frequency of UHF. Oh, sorry, my neighbor. Ultra high frequency is from 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz, which is the 1 meter to 100 millimeter wavelength. And of course, we know the 70 centimeter band and the 23 centimeter bands. Then, as you'll see in the text, the high bands is high AHF to low VHF. That's the 15, 12, 10, and 6 meter bands. As you progress with when you get your license, you'll start knowing these terminology very well. The low bands is low HF and upper MF, medium frequency, which is 160, 80, 60, and 40 meters. And then the mid bands, it's between high and low, 40 meters to 17 meters. So if you look on the third paragraph in your text, another term that we'll use regularly is DX, which is an old telegraphy abbreviation for distance, and is used to describe long distance contacts. The definition is a little flexible on the high bands, but here I think there's a mistake here. We'll just think about what is written here. On the high bands, long distance contacts are easy. I think it must be the low bands. And a contact to Central Africa might not be regarded as DX. And on the low or high bands with less effective antennas and higher noise, on VHF with mostly line of sight communications, the same contact might be construed as great DX. So just read through that thing and think about what is written here. I do not completely agree with it, or I might be wrong. All right, let's look at path loss. Now, let me see. So the first paragraph I summarized. As radio waves travel from the transmitting antenna, they spread out in space, such as seen with concentric circles, which I tried to show you here. And then as the signal moves away from the origin, the larger the area, there's a Q there that I should remove, outside of the sphere that needs to be converted. So at the speed of light, this whole sphere increases at a very rapid rate. then consequently the signal strength at any point in the space decreases moving away from the origin. And I've put a red line there just as a representative of how signal strength can rapidly decrease what we call asymptotically, if you had your maths at school and so. And so imagine a transmitter. You see the next slide here. I've just made some calculations just to illustrate to you. If you have a transmitter here in the center of the line, and you've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 kilometers, and how the surface area increases as the signal progresses outwards. So first, to determine the surface area is this 4 pi r squared. So for 1 kilometer, it's 12.6 square kilometers. When the signal moves out to 2 kilometers, obviously at a very rapid speed, the surface area increases to 50 kilometers. We're still just working in 2D here now. 50 kilometers. Say, for instance, you have a flat piece of earth and the signal runs along the earth. 50.3 kilometers, square kilometers. Then at 3 kilometers, the surface area, you can see it increases rapidly, 113 square kilometers, and at 4 kilometers, it goes up to 201 square kilometers. But there's an interesting ratio. If you now look at it, the first one, if you divide 50.3 by 12.6, you get a ratio of 3.99. Let's make it 4. If you take 201 kilometers divided by 53, so that's the 4 kilometers divided by the 2 kilometers. So the radius has been squared. The ratio stays the same, but just look again now here at the number 3. 201 square kilometers divided by 12.6 square kilometers. The ratio increases to 16. So you can see as it progresses outwards, the ratio increases to at a very rapid rate. Now, so in free space, say for instance, you've got a transmitter in a spaceship, and I'll get to you now, just illustrating a practical example. So the strength decreases as the square of the distance. So as the square of the distance increases, the signal decreases very rapidly. So if the distance is doubled, the signal strength drops by a quarter, to a quarter, not by a quarter, to a quarter. At 3 times the distance, the signal strength drops to 1/9, and at 10 times the distance, only 1/100th of the signal is left. So I've made a little spreadsheet here. So you're looking at 1 squared, 1 over squared is 1, obviously. If you have a radius of 2, 2 squared is 4, but the signal strength drops to 1 over r squared. It's 1 over 4 is 0.25. And if you double the r, r squared, it becomes 16 is r squared, and 1 over 16 is 0.06. And when your ratio or your radius increases to 8, the r squared is 64, and 1 over 64 is 0.02. Now you get rapidly to figures where it goes down to 1 to the 10 to the minus 10 and so on as we progress. So I just make 2 little graphs here, and you'll see, and there's your radius is 1. If it increases to 2, the corresponding graph is shown here as the signal 1 over r squared goes down. And this one, I put 2 separate graphs. So you'll see as we go to 4, there it goes even down still further. And when we get to 100 radius, the signal strength goes very low. So take, for example, the Voyager spacecraft that was launched in 1977. Now, this spacecraft went through our solar system. I think it's already left the solar system, and it's gone beyond, I think, 3 to 5 billion kilometers away from Earth. So here you sit with a moving transmitter that goes away at the speed of, say, more than 25,000 kilometers per hour. So now you can imagine, just think about this concept, how weak that strength goes. And you have to take in account every second that the spacecraft moves away from Earth, and you sit with a very weak signal. You can send out a very strong signal to the spacecraft, but the signal that comes back to you is very limited. So you'll have to have a very sensitive antenna, and you also need to take into account the velocity of this spacecraft. So that it actually boggles the mind when you start thinking of that. So this is what we call the inverse square law, 1 over r squared. So let's look at the butter gun. This is not part of your syllabus, but it just illustrates the inverse square law. So for guys who had physics, Johan and myself, we had physics at university, and we had to very early have to learn what the inverse square law is. So we have got a theoretical, I'm not sure if there's somebody tried actually to do that. It might have been a very lazy person who got sick of buttering toast. So you've got a butter gun who fires a patch of butter mounted, butter at a piece of toast mounted on a board against the wall. So if the toast is 1 length unit away, let's make it 1 meter, they've got it here in feet, the toast gets a thick layer of butter. Every time you shoot the same amount of butter, at 2 units away, you've got 4 pieces of toast, and the same amount of butter will cover 4 pieces, obviously. And each piece gets a layer that is as quarter as thick. And at 3 length units away, 9 pieces of, I can't spell toast, toasts are covered with a thin layer, each 1/9 the original thickness. So that's how the inverse square law actually works. So we now talking about a growing sphere as the signals expand from the source, and that's what we imply with it is path loss. A radio signal transmitted into space can be visualized as an expanding sphere. It can be compared with a light bulb switched on in a dark room. So 3 factors play a role. First off, the source. When the light source is turned on, it emits a fixed amount of light energy in all directions. Then you get expansion. As the light energy travels away from the source, it spreads out to cover the surface of an ever-growing sphere. And then we get dilution, obviously, because the total amount of energy stays the same, but the volume of the sphere increases. The energy becomes thinner or gets diluted or less concentrated at any single point within that sphere. Right, I'm sure you understand this concept very quickly. So, the ratio between the strength of the transmitted and the received signal is called the path loss. And you'll see at great distances, very little signal is actually left, and path loss is expressed in decibel, which is a log value, and I'm sure you've done the decibel already. Right, there on the bottom of page 252, we're going to talk about direct wave or line of sight propagation. So, electromagnetic radiation generally travels in straight lines. It's like as vectors, we call it vectors. For communication to be possible, it requires that radio waves can travel straight from the transmitting antenna to the receiving antenna without being blocked by obstructions. The simplest form of propagation is known as direct wave or line of sight propagation, and I'll show you a figure on the next page. So that's where you have 2 towers, maybe on a mountain, 2 mountains. And that's also known as line of sight propagation. It may be misleading, as things that block light will let radio waves pass. So we're not talking of actually light as it implies. So this sentence here on the bottom of page 252, I think there's a bit of something left out there, and I just put the 2 words in. Direct wave propagation occurs at various and of all frequencies, and I think that must be I think it's all frequencies. Over a flat terrain, with both antennas more or less 10 meters high, the range of direct wave propagation will be about 20 kilometers. So hilly terrain can be used by placing one of the antennas on top of the hill where it can be seen from much further away. And here where we stay in the Moot, we've got a lot of antennas, towers with antennas here on the mountain, on the Magalies Mountain. So here's just a figure here, which I would like to show you. So VHF repeaters, and the same with our 2-meter repeater, and our 70-centimeter repeater also are usually located on the high sites, and they rely on direct wave propagation. And you'll see here in the figure, you've got one tower here with an antenna and another one on the right, and you'll see the direct wave just going straight right through the other antenna. They can achieve, beg your pardon, wide coverage at distances in a region of 100 kilometer. So ground wave propagation is a bit different. Let me see just where I am. Page over. Right. Low and medium frequencies travel along the surface of the Earth while it's being refracted. So it's refracted on the surface. It runs around the surface of the Earth. And refraction is caused by the nearby ground slowing the radio wave down slightly, causing it to bend again down to the Earth, to the ground, and then it gets reflected up, it slows down, it hits the Earth, and so it carries on. Of course, the ground itself is bending with the curvature of the Earth. The effect is that the ground wave follows the Earth's surface, but I must stress it cannot carry on indefinitely. At one stage, with the little bit of energy lost with each refraction on the surface of the Earth, as we say, a little bit of energy gets lost, and at the end your signal gets lost over a distance. It might be 20 or 100 kilometer or even less. So if you have a 5-watt handheld little transmitter and you're chatting with the other guy, and we've done it with rallies, and he's 10 kilometers away, it's impossible. That 5-watt signal is not going to reach you. So you'll have to do a 20-watt or 30-watt with a collinear antenna standing on a small tower, just to get more power out and compensate for the loss on in the ground. So the refraction is most pronounced at lower frequencies, and this effect is more significant in the lower frequency and medium frequency bands. So for HF and that ground refraction, high power, it's a good combination. But for VHF and UHF, not so good. It's present, but less, and here we say effective in the HF bands, but really absent at VHF and above. And then you have to be a bit more creative to get your signal out. So let's read on paragraphs 4 to 5 on page 253. Medium MF or medium wave and AM commercial broadcast stations can be received up to 100 kilometers or so away from the transmitter. The medium wave broadcast band, that's 530 kilohertz to 1.6 megahertz, is low enough for good ground wave propagation to occur. However, commercial FM transmitters use VHF frequencies, that's the normal FM that we listen, 88 to 108 megahertz, which are only propagated by direct wave. And so they are usable within 10 to 15 kilometers of the transmitter, depending on the terrain. And you'll see, for example, when you listen to RSG, they've got quite a high site where they put quite a bit of watts out, and you receive it quite well here in Pretoria or wherever you are. But if you move out to, say, you get in your car and you go out to Witbank, Middelburg, the signal disappears. And I always like to listen to Bosveld Stereo, their transmitters there in Brit, but you battle to hear them quite well. So that gives you an idea of how it works and what your limitations are. Now, the same ground interactions that allows the wave to refract around the curvature of the Earth also attenuate it. And attenuate means it lowers the effectivity of the signal, limiting the range of ground wave propagation to a few 100 kilometers, depending on the power of the transmitter. So that's very important. So here you see is we've got two antennas with the ground wave moving between them. So if you can get get hold of these articles, I'm sure you can take screenshots or take a look again at the video. There's some references that I put in here, articles that you can download to read. We'll talk a bit later about skywaves. Now, I've got a bit of a problem here, but I'll sort it out for you. I was not, the atmosphere doesn't consist of just 3 layers. So let me just put that straight to you. It says here on page 253, the first paragraph, below 27.5, the atmosphere. That's very simplified. The atmosphere consists of 3 layers, troposphere, stratosphere, and ionosphere. So let's stop right here, and let me just show you. And I give credit, I forgot to put the reference in here, but this is a very nice slide, and whoever, I'll put it in later again, the reference where I got this, and this is a very nice picture of the layers of the Earth, and as you'll see, it's a bit more complex than just the ionosphere. So let's start with the troposphere. That's the lower layer that we live in, where we breathe, and it goes up to about 12 kilometers. Now, the commercial jet airliners fly just above the troposphere because the air molecules are a bit less there, and there's less drag on your aeroplanes. So we live very happily, and I see might be Mount Everest, which I think is about 10 kilometers. Right, next up is the stratosphere. Stratosphere ranges between 12 and 50 kilometers, and there you go. There's not much, there's actually no oxygen left there for human beings to breathe. And then we go to the mesosphere, and that's 50 to 80 kilometers. And obviously it gets very cold and low, absolutely very little oxygen to survive there. So yeah, up in the stratosphere, going up, it's very difficult to survive. Then we get the Kármán line, which is more or less the edge of our atmosphere and where space starts. Let me just put one thing clear, make one thing clear. These layers are not fixed as lines as we show it here. It's variable. So it's all these things are very variable, and there's some plasticity involved here. Right, then we go up to the thermosphere. I'll show you now where the ionosphere fits in. The thermosphere is where we see the auroras, we see the space shuttle and the International Space Station. There's really no, or very, very little, maybe 1 atom per cubic meter of oxygen there. And that stretches from 80 to 700 kilometers. And the exosphere, it's from 700 to 10,000 kilometers. So I was up this morning until 2 o'clock looking at the Artemis II spaceship that was launched, and that spaceship is about 41,000 kilometers away from us. So it's outside the exosphere, moving around the Earth. So now let's look. Now, there on the left, there's a red arrow, double-sided arrow, stretching from the mesosphere up to the exosphere. And you'll see this is where the ionosphere is located. So the ionosphere is not a simple one layer. It includes from the mesosphere right up to the exosphere, just to make that clear. So the ionosphere, let's look at the different layers of the ionosphere. You have to read a bit more as we go along, or when you have time. Take your time and read this sections on page 253 up to 254 very carefully. And while you're doing that, just look at the YouTube video. So the first paragraph in 27.5 on page 253, it said 3 layers, troposphere, stratosphere, and ionosphere, and it discussed where these 3 layers are. And as I explained, it's not only 3 layers. So let's look at the second paragraph. The ionosphere is that part of the upper atmosphere where free electrons occur in sufficient density to have an appreciable influence of the propagation of radio frequency electromagnetic waves. So it extends approximately from 50 kilometers. Let me just make the slide, complete the slide here. Right, and then while I'm reading, look at this slide. It extends from approximately 50 kilometers to 800 kilometers plus above the Earth's surface. In the ionosphere, high-energy solar radiation, X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, and particles from the solar wind strip electrons from some gas molecules. Not sure what gas molecules are talking about, but then you just sit with the protons, there's no electrons. No electrons on the gas molecules, and you've got these free electrons moving around them, leaving positively charged and free electrons. So they are removed from each other. You've got the positively charged ions and the free electrons, what someone say, swift around there. This pea soup of particles is known as the plasma. Right, the ionosphere is divided into 4 layers, and you'll see at the bottom the D layer, which includes, and that's where you just have to understand what's going on there. The D layer includes the upper mesosphere, and it extends from 50 to 90 kilometers above the surface of the air, and this D layer is only present during daylight hours. As soon as the sun's ionizing radiation is no longer present, electrons, so while the sun is shining in that specific area where you are, electrons and ions, beg your pardon, the D layer is there. But as soon as it gets night in a specific area, electrons and ions rapidly recombine to form neutral anion gas, and the D layer disappears. But this is a very dynamic process that takes place. As the sun moves the area, a D layer develops and it disappears. It develops and disappears. So it moves around the Earth as the sun goes around. This is very important. The principal effect of the D layer is to absorb radio waves. Although some absorption takes place at all frequencies, the amount of absorption decreases with the square of the frequency. There we go again. So it affects low frequencies much more than high frequencies. Right, so the upper 3 layers of the ionosphere have different effects. Instead of simply absorbing radio waves, they also bend the waves by means of refraction. So the similar effect that you get with the surface of the Earth, you get by refraction by these layers. If a wave is bent sufficiently, it may return to Earth, and a considerable distance from the transmitter, almost as at a distance from the transmitter, or almost as though it has been reflected off the ionosphere, and this we use to our benefit. The amount of refraction or bending depends on, number one, the frequency, and is more pronounced at lower frequencies, not so much the higher frequencies. We're talking about HF propagation here. The upper layers, and you'll see here on the figures, just look at the figure while I'm reading. The upper layers are the E layer, which extends from, let me just pave over, about 19 to 150 kilometers. So that's the E layer, and it includes the lower thermosphere above the surface. Then the F1 layer, which includes the thermosphere, which extends from about 150 to 180 kilometers. And then the F2 layer right there on top, which includes the thermosphere up to the exosphere. And that extends from 180 I beg your pardon, to 300 kilometers or higher. So let's make it then 180 to more than 800 kilometers. So at night, the E layer dissipates, while the F2 and F1 layers combine to form a single F layer that is less strongly ionized during the daytime, because the sun is not there to ionize these layers. So this picture you've got now there, and let's carry on. Now we're going to get to that figure. Right, let's recap again here. The D layer, which is upper mesosphere, only present during daylight hours. When the solar radiation is not present, electrons and ions rapidly recombine to form neutral or unionized gas, and then the D layer disappears in the day. And the principal effect of the D layer is to absorb radio waves. The upper three layers do not absorb radio waves, but they bend them by refraction. If a wave is bent sufficiently, it may return to Earth a considerable distance from the transmitter, almost as though it had been reflected off the ionosphere. The amount of refraction or bending depends on the frequency and is more pronounced at lower frequencies. This is just a recap of what we said here. And then the upper layers are the E layer, 90 to 150 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Ek wil net hoor julle my nog daar so, Henry? Dit bevestig?
Ja.
Okay, goed. Let's carry on. Right, the upper layers is almal nog gelukkig. The upper layers are first the E layer, 90 to 150 kilometers above the Earth's surface, which I also call the cannellini or the heaviside layer. Then the F1 layer, 150 to 180 kilometers. The F2 layer, 180 to 300 kilometers. So at night, the E layer dissipates while the F2 and F1 and F2 layers combine to form a single F layer, which is called the Appleton-Barnett layer, that is less strongly ionized than during the daytime. So here's that figure there on page 254. So at the day, you've got the D, the E, the F1, and the F2 layers. During the day, the D layer dissipates, you still got the E layer, and then the F1 and F2 combine to form a single F layer. Right, this is a very important concept. The ionosphere is not a separate layer of the atmosphere, but rather a region. And this, as I say, is a very plastic type of thing. There's gradual moving over from the one layer to the other layer. But where high energy solar radiation strips electrons from gas atoms, creating a soup of free electrons and ions. Right. So while the ionosphere starts in the upper mesosphere and extends through the thermosphere into the exosphere, its specific layers D, E, and F are defined by electron density rather than temperature or gas composition. So it all depends on this electron density. Okay, let's look at skywave or ionospheric propagation, which is I think a very common way of operating your radios and utilizing the characteristics of the atmosphere. So on page 254, 27.6, you'll see skywave or ionospheric propagation. And the first three paragraphs I'll summarize in slides. The fourth paragraph we'll read. But just go and read this very carefully through and make sure you understand it. I don't think that the questions are going to be so complex. This is quite a complex subject, but it's actually quite very interesting. Right, so I've summarized the first paragraph there. During daytime, the D layer absorbs low frequencies. Higher frequencies penetrate the D layer with some attenuation, of course, and become refracted back to the Earth by the E, F1 or F2 layers. All right. Now, the second paragraph, even higher frequencies will not be refracted sufficiently by the E layer, the F1 or F2 layers, and will continue straight into space instead of being refracted back to Earth. That's your UHF and your VHF frequencies. Long distance HF communications are made possible by refraction by the F2 layer during the daytime and then the single F layer during nighttime. And in the night, during night, as we've shown in the figure, the D layer dissipates almost immediately, and the E layer more gradually. But I think it does not disappear completely, while the F1 and the F2 layers combine to form a single, less strongly ionized layer. Now that there is no D layer to absorb low frequencies, they can be reflected from the F layer, that combined F layer, and travel long distances. And we're talking thousands of kilometers. However, high frequencies are not refracted sufficiently by the more weakly ionized nighttime F layer, so they'll be lost in space, of course. So let's read the third paragraph. Note that fairly high frequencies may still be usable well after local sunset. Because a plasma is a poor conductor, it takes a considerable time for ionization levels in the F1 and F2 layers to decrease to their nighttime values. Also, because these layers are high above the surface of the Earth, they'll be illuminated for some time after local sunset. And finally, for paths from east to west, and that's where they use it quite a lot, from paths from east to west, the point where the waves need to be refracted will be located some distance to the west of the transmitter, where the sun will still be shining. So you're using that, the fact that the sun is moving to the west, you're using that to your advantage. I'm sure you understand what I mean there. Right, let's talk about the skip. So that's the last 3 paragraphs on page 254. A skip occurs when the signals are refracted from the ionosphere. The maximum skip distance from for the E layer is about 2,500 kilometers and about 5,000 kilometers for the F layer. That's a single skip. So it shows you with on HF, your conditions are right, you can reach far distances. 5,000 kilometers is about halfway to America. Longer skip paths may also be achieved by multi-hop propagation, where the refracted signal bounces off the surface of the Earth, back to the ionosphere and refracted back to the Earth again. So it goes a zigzag pattern, hitting the ionosphere and then hitting the Earth. Now, up to 10 such hops can occur under exceptional circumstances, providing propagation to points anywhere in the Earth, even via the long path. I get goosebumps when I read this. It's so exciting and interesting using nature to your advantage. There is normally a range of distances in which a signal cannot be heard. If the receiver is too close to the transmitter to receive a skip and not too far from direct or ground wave, this area is known as the skip zone. In the skip zone, no or weak signals can also be heard, and on the high bands, the skip zone typically extends from 100 to 1,000 kilometers. Right, let's look at some definitions and concepts. I see it's 19:30. We'll get done by 8 o'clock. So let's first look at, and you'll see here at the bottom of page 254, I just summarized it, paraphrased it. Maximum usable frequency, or MUF, maximum usable frequency. The highest frequency that can be used on a particular path for communication between two particular places at a particular time. It is dependent on the degree of ionization present in the ionosphere. Okay. Then EIRP, and that you will, if you page over, this page also over here. So, they say by increasing the EIRP, and the EIRP is the effective isotropic radiated power. That won't help, because if the frequency is above the path MUF, the additional power will just be radiated into space. So I would like you to, and I'll say it here in the bottom of this slide, go read about EIRP, or effective isotropic radiated power. So the lowest usable frequency, or the LUF, is that frequency that can be used for a particular path. The LUF depends not only on the amount of ionization, but also on the amount of atmospheric and man-made noise present at the receiver, and not on the EIRP of the signal. And then, I beg your pardon. Optimal traffic frequency, I'm just trying to see where it is here. But anyway, that is when the D-layer absorption and atmospheric noise on both decrease as the transmitter frequency increases. Therefore, the best propagation can be found just below the MUF. So you just have to get that frequency just a bit lower, and then you'll see where your sweet spot is. The best frequency producing the best communication for a path is the OTF, or optimal traffic frequency. Right, I see it here on page 255, and I see slide 19. So please go and do some extra reading and so on to see what EIRP really is and what the theoretical isotropic antenna is. So they go hand in hand. If you see, EIRP is effective isotropic radiated power. So the theoretical isotropic antenna is part of this definition. And just familiarize yourself with these two definitions. Right, now we get to solar cycles. So I think it's a lot of our favorites. And if you've listened to our bulletins on Sunday mornings, you would have heard that we talk a lot about the solar, the sun, and also on the South African Radio League, the bulletins. Every week when they do solar propagation news, we've got specifically propagation news, a lot of is discussed. And also the sun, the effect of the sun is taken into account to a great extent. So MUFs and LUFs depend on the extent of ionization in the ionosphere. That's very important. This ionization varies with the time of the day and with the season and with the amount of solar activity. And you can read there also on a page, the second last paragraph on page 255. So I'll just summarize that second last paragraph there. Solar activity follows cycles approximately 11 years long. Every 11 years, there's a solar maximum when high levels of solar activity generate intense ionization, and MUFs can extend well above 50 megahertz during daylight hours, giving great long-distance openings on the 6-meter and 10-meter amateur bands. About 7 years later, there will be a solar minimum, where MUFs may be under 20 megahertz. The 6-meter and 10-meter bands will be mostly inactive, while propagation on the low bands, 160 and 80 meters, will be better than usual. So it goes up and down. So at specific points on the solar cycle, it will bend one band, but it will be to the detriment of another band. So let me read first there on the bottom of page 255, and I'll read a bit also there on page 256 before we progress further. Now they talk here about solar cycle 24 peaked in 2015. Solar cycles have been numbered since 1755, and you'll see here on the slide, that's more or less the time that they started really observing solar cycles. And they call that area before that, from the 1600s to up to 1750, as the Maunder minimum. And it's just because there wasn't probably not enough observations. So when regular observations on sunspots started being recorded since 1755. And this small diagram on page 256, it's a bit small, but I've enlarged it. So the diagram shows the sunspot number by day. Cycle 23 peaked about in 2001. Of course, we're now in cycle 26, 26 at the moment. So cycle 23 peaked about 2001 at the sunspot number of 120. Cycle 24 peaked twice. The highest peak was in 2050. At the sunspot number of 80, leaving a lot of amateurs very disappointed. Cycle 24 is said to be having the worst in the history of radio. Hey, yeah, sorry, man. Fortunately, we're now on cycle 25. As from 2023, cycle 25 seems to be outperforming the gloomy forecast. Regular high band openings are available all over the globe. Cycle 25 is suspected to peak during 2025. And so here is a very nice picture. But if you overall look at the trend, here from 1985, the peaks show a downward trend. There you can see over 270 there in 1990, and then about 210 here in cycle 23, and you'll see cycle 24. As they said, which peaked in 2015, the peak was about 130. So then, now we're on cycle 25, and we are more or less at the stage where we run around between 120 to 150 at the moment. So they expect it going down there by 2030. Right, let's go further. What I would like you to read, I just want to see where we are now. Okay, we're going to look at solar indices. Let me see where, sorry, just a moment, see where I'm now at the moment, 256, yeah, I'm at the right place. Okay, so there's a bit of reading you have to do there. I'm not going to read everything today, but you'll see, oh, here's our slides 24 to 27, solar activity. I'm just going to read quickly. Solar activity is measured in two different units, the sunspot number, SN, or the solar flux index. They correlate very well, allowing modern flux measurements to be compared to previous cycles. Other important parameters include A and K, of which give an indication of how stormy the solar surface is. So let's just discuss that particular paragraph. Right, there we go. Sunspot number and solar flux index and the correlation between them. Solar activity is, I've got the two same slides here. Sorry, I made a mistake there. So let's look at the next slide. So I would like you to go and download this article, and it's on the ARRL website. It's called Understanding Solar Indices. Go and look at it, read through it, and you'll see what solar, we're not going to do a very, when we start with solar indices, we can talk another hour, let me say that. But get yourself familiarized what solar indices are. And then I invite you, if you have a radio on Sunday mornings, listen to our bulletin, and I give a summary of the solar conditions and what the possible effect is. So what we look at and what we broadcast to our listeners is the HF band information, daytime and nighttime conditions, 80 to 40 meters. You'll see there's fair in the daytime, good in the night. And it correlates with what we said previously. 30 to 20 meters, good, both days, and 17 to 50 meters, both good day and night. And then we look at the sunspot number, there to the right, 137. This is this week's, I think it was last week's figures. And something interesting is happening here. The sunspot number has gone up a little bit, and you see the solar flux. But go and read and see what every parameter is all about. Solar flux, overall solar activities at 10.70 centimeters, geomagnetic storm, the solar wind, the speed of the solar wind, and that's not 460 kilometers per hour. This is 460 kilometers per second. So it's more than 1 million kilometers per hour when you calculate it. Then you look at the noise floor, the KP index, the 304 angstrom value. I'm not going to elaborate. All of a sudden, and I've seen a message that Henry sent to me, and I forgot to put it up, but I'm just going to look at it again. Henry, but anyway, it corresponds with what is written here. Electron flux, which is the density of charged electrons in the solar wind, which impacts the E layer, of course, 23,600. But with that, the proton flux, density of charged protons in the solar wind, which also impacts the layer, it's 28,500. This is very high at the moment. So there's something is brewing at the moment, and we'll see within the next week or so. We had a big solar flare on the 18th of January this year, which had quite a big impact on communications, and the solar wind went up to 1,050 kilometers per second. The geomagnetic storm was severe, and so on. So things were really not good on the 18th of January and the days that follow that. So that's a very interesting subject separate from just propagation to look at it, but it's got a profound influence on propagation. And here's the A and K values, and this values are in that publication there by Poole, 2002, Understanding Solar Indices, on the QST magazine, September 22, 2002, page 38 and 40. Please download it and read it. It's very, very well written and informative. Right, let's talk about a very interesting subject. I want you to, we're going to skip a couple of points here, or maybe I should just read through it. I'm just trying to keep to our time. So if you look at 27.7 on page 257, sporadic E-propagation, backscatter, meteoscatter, auroral scatter, and then tropospheric bending scatter and ducting. Please go and read it by yourself. We need to save a bit of time here, also to go through our questions, to familiarize yourself with these concepts here. It's not difficult, so I'm just going to leave it to you yourself too. One thing that's very interesting here, the sporadic E-propagation. There is a question about it, but I'll work through with you with that, and also meteoscatter. But those are things that we use to enhance our propagation or to utilize when we do radio context. And I would like to talk now about EME and then amateur radio satellites. And I think then we'll conclude. Okay, also propagation prediction, because I see there's about 9 minutes left. Okay, EME, and that's in our club, it's a very familiar concept. And I'll show you now. EME involves bouncing signals off the moon to some distant location on Earth, also known as moon bounce. On the VHF bands and above, EME is the primary mode for intercontinental DX contacts, as ionic spheric propagation is exceedingly rare. So you shoot your signal right through the ionosphere and you use the moon. And you have to be very careful about how you orientate your antennas. The losses are tremendous, with a path loss of 250 dB. That's quite a lot. Now I've just simplified that figure there, and it's only about 1 to the power of 10 to the 1 times 10 to the power of minus 25 of the 20 of the transmitted signal is actually returns to Earth. So an EME station is a significant technical challenge involving mechanical construction, antenna work, low noise receivers, high power transmitters, a tracking mechanism, and very astute operating procedures. EME was used to be the exclusive preserve of those with very high power stations and large steerable antenna arrays. I'll show you a couple of photos now. With new weak signal and digital modes like JT65, modestly equipped stations can experience EME contacts, especially if the other station has high power and large antennas. But you don't have that facility, so you can just. And here's some of these antennas, which are quite magnificent. If you look here at the below left, you'll see here in the center, very complex rotating system, and then all these Yagis at different frequencies. And here on the top, but here's the one. Here's from Germany. You'll see he's operating on 432 megahertz, and he's got a passive reflector system. And EME Erde is Earth, Moon, Earth. And you see some of these people go extreme. Now, I must tell you, I think all radio amateurs are a bit of exhibitionists, and they can be quite dramatic sometimes. And I think this is a very good example. And then if you are interested on EME, you can also look at the Facebook groups. There are quite a bit of these groups that you can follow there. Now, so if you look there, they say only about 5 South Africans have contacted over 100 countries on the 144 megahertz band using EME. Someone local may achieve contacts with over 100 countries on 430 megahertz by 2025. I'm not sure how Jan is doing. Jan Point Pinos at the 6OB. He's a very well-known radio ham in our club, and he's very active in this field. And I didn't have actually time to ask him, but I'll ask him if you meet him one day. He's very technically very advanced with all his equipment, and he's a very good antenna builder. And
I know his son.
Excuse?
His son was.
Yeah.
I know his son.
It's-
His son is a colleague of mine, former colleague.
Okay. Yeah. So Jan, there's all his call signs. He was first in Africa and second in the Southern Hemisphere. So we all know Jan. He was actually my first contact when I started amateur radio. Right, let's look at amateur radio satellites. And you'll see, just a moment, there are a number of amateur radio satellites which are in orbit, which relay signals in various modes, FM, SSB, CW, and digital. And they act as terrestrial repeaters, and then signals are sent up to the satellite on one band, which is called the uplink band, and received from it on a different band, which is the downlink band. And I'll show you an example now. A pair of uplink and downlink bands is known as a mode. And modes are described using two letters, which represent the uplink and downlink bands. Example mode V-U, which has a 2-meter uplink and a 70-centimeter downlink. So the V stands for VHF, which is a 2-meter band, and U for UHF, which is a 70-centimeter band. So amateur satellites were traditionally given an OSCA amateur radio number, or radio number by AMSAT. And so OSCA is a satellite carrying amateur radio. And AMSAT is the International Amateur Satellite Corporation. And we also have an AMSAT SA here in South Africa. It's really a good organization to join. It's free of charge, and they have good seminars, which they occasionally present. So numbers such as AO40 mean AMSAT OSCA 40, and AO7 is the oldest surviving amateur satellite. So, just see where we are here. I'm gonna read, if you could read by yourself, page 258, the bottom. Let's see, we have about a couple of minutes left. And 259, the top. And I just want to stress one thing, because satellites move at high speed. That's the second paragraph from the top on page 259. They exhibit Doppler shift. If you don't know what Doppler shift is, please go and read up. The operator may have to look for the downlink of a frequency slightly displaced from the nominal frequencies because of Doppler shift, and may have to adjust the uplink frequency to a slightly different frequency that's used by the uplink receiver. So that comes with practice, taking in account the Doppler shift. So I'm just going to talk about the Quebec OSCA 100 satellite. We talk about it a lot every Sunday with our bulletins. There's a lot of people working these satellites to contact stations at various points on the globe. So the Quebec 100 is a completely new generation of amateur radio geostationary satellite. And a geostationary satellite is one that stays on one point above a continent. I'll show you a picture now. A fixed dish antenna of about 800 millimeter can be used to work the Quebec OSCA 100 at any time during day or night. So it doesn't matter. You've got a right straight signal, you go through the ionosphere. It covers all of Europe and Africa, as well as portions of Asia. So it's a very handy satellite. This. Over 100 countries have been contacted by South Africans using this satellite. It uses microwave equipment, so you're in the gigahertz range, but you use low power. And once the equipment is in place, it's a very easy satellite to work. And this is called actually the Eutelsat satellite, which is geostationary right here above us. And you can see portions of North Africa, Arabia, India, basically all of Europe and Britain. And there at the top, maybe you might reach some parts closer to America. So we were fortunate to attend the lecture of this Eutelsat presented by the AMSAT when it went up. It was in 2018, after that, just before COVID. SL2 or the Qatar Oscar 100 or Quebec Oscar 100 is a Qatari satellite launched aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket on 15th of November 2018. SL2 was built by Japan's Mitsubishi Electrical Company and operates at 26 degrees east longitude along a geostationary orbit to provide direct-to-home television services, of course. That's the primary reason. In the Middle East and North Africa, the satellite featured two 24 Ku band and 11 Ka band transponders to provide direct broadcasting services for television, government, and commercial content distribution. Now, here's the nice thing. In addition to commercial services, the payload of SL2 includes a linear transponder with a bandwidth of 500 kilohertz and 8 megahertz for the amateur radio satellite service, and with an uplink on 2.4 gigahertz, that's the 13 centimeter band, and a downlink on 10.45 gigahertz, 3 centimeter bands. If you want to build these things, it's very, very small. It's easy to build. Antenna, it's a little struck there on a piece of PC board. So that's a very nice one to use. Let's conclude here with propagation prediction. Now, broadcasting, commercial and government users of radio have long had the need to predict propagation. As our understanding of the modern ionosphere has improved, the accuracy of forecasting has also improved. Prediction of propagation on any path can be done using the VOACAP, or the Voice of America Coverage Analysis Program, which is a radio propagation model that uses empirical data to predict the point-to-point path loss and coverage of a given transceiver if given as inputs. Two antennas, as its inputs, two antennas configurations and position, solar weather, and time and date. It was written in Fortran many years ago, as it was originally designed for the Voice of America. And here is some of the pictures when you use the VOACAP program, and you can see the hot zones here. That's where your propagation is at its best. And yeah, I think this is a part of, I don't show the country, but I think this is Finland. Right, so for satellite and line of sight systems, the path loss can be calculated using the normal decay of signal strength with distance as a function, or signal strength as a distance, as a function of distance. Beg your pardon. So the first one that you calculate is path loss in dB, and you see it, everything is there in your text. Very easy mathematics there. And using the LP there, you substitute. I don't think you'll get a question like this in the amateur radio exam, but we just show this as an example. So you can read there on page 259 what this is all about. And then let's just conclude there on page 260. Once the expected received power is known, it can be compared with the receiver sensitivity specifications and the likely ambient noise conditions to determine the likely signal to noise ratio. This ratio in dB must be compared to the minimum required signal to noise ratio to determine the link margin, the amount of unanticipated loss that can be tolerated before the link will no longer function. A similar approach can also be followed to calculate the minimum required transmitter power. So that's our lecture. And I'm afraid you have to go and do a lot of reading over and over again. Go get on Google or your AI and work through this. I've got a whole book pasted full of articles and things here for that I've been at for years on propagation. So it's a very complicated subject. It can sometimes be very difficult, but it's worthwhile to go and study this more in detail. Ek wil net hoor, Henry, hoeveel tyd het ons nog oor?
Louis, kyk, ons is programgewys onbeperk. So jy kan aangaan.
Ja.
Dit word opgeneem en dit gaan op YouTube gaan. So diegene wat nie kan bybly nie, kan gaan en dit dan later kyk. Maar daar's nie 'n beperking nie. As ons 2 ure moet sit, dan sit ons 2 ure.
Okay. All right. Baie dankie, Henry. So I'm just going to read the summary. You can just go along with me in the text. On page 260, you'll see the summary, and then we'll look at the review questions. Direct wave or line of sight propagation is when signals of any frequency travel directly from the transmitter to the receiver. Ground wave propagation is where low and medium frequency signals follow the curvature of the Earth up to a distance of several hundred kilometers. Ionospheric propagation results from the refraction of radio waves by the E, F1 and F2 ionospheric layers. During daylight hours, the D layer absorbs low frequency signals, so only higher frequencies are usable. The D layer dissipates rapidly after dark, allowing even low frequency signals to reach the F layer. Higher frequency signals are not refracted sufficiently by the ionosphere to return to Earth, but are lost in space. But we also utilize that. The skip zone is the area with the first hop in which a signal cannot be heard, as it is too far for direct ground wave and too close for skip. I just want to, while I was reading the previous sentence, are lost in space. We use this also to connect to the space station. Of course, you can have conversations, QSOs there with the space station. There's always a radio amateur on the space station. So if you want to pursue that, normally you've got a 6-minute window to contact one of them. So that's where you use that characteristic. The critical frequency is the highest frequency at which radiation directed vertically upwards will return to Earth. The maximum usable frequency for a particular path is the maximum frequency that will be refracted by an ionosphere along a path, and it may be considerably higher than the critical frequency. The lowest usable frequency, or the LUF, is the lowest frequency that can be used for communication on a particular path, and depends on the EIRP of the transmitter and the receiver noise level, as well as the extent of ionization. Ionospheric propagation via the F layer occurs most commonly for the high frequency or HF bands, although there are occasional openings on the 6-meter band. We call that also the magic band. The amount of ionization depends on the time of the day, season, and the 11-year solar cycle. Multipath propagation could result in enhancement and destruction of the signal, leading to fading. Fading could vary vary the signal strength by tens of dB and could have a period of milliseconds to hours. Sporadic E-propagation consists of the refraction of VHF signals by intensely ionized patches of the E layer. We did not discuss it, but so please go and read up on that more detailed. These patches occur sporadically, but may last for several hours and allow VHF communication at ranges from 100 to several thousand kilometers. Backscatter allows close in contact on the HF bands when signals are scattered from the surface after the first hop. Meteor scatter mostly uses specialized digital modes to communicate during the very brief periods of intense ionization caused by meteors entering the Earth's atmosphere. Tropospheric scatter results from signals being affected by temperature and humidity difference in the atmosphere and can result in consistent VHF and UHF communications over ranges of 100 to more than 500 kilometers with suitable equipment. Tropospheric ducting, when VHF signals are trapped between the ground and inversion layer or between two inversion layers, is much less common but can result in signals being received with good strengths thousands of kilometers away. Auroral scatter reflects rough signals from the polar regions, allowing long-distance VHF and UHF contacts. So go and read about that more in those sections that I did not discuss in detail. Earth-Moon-Earth, where EME is technically challenging, but because of the extreme path laws. Nevertheless, EME is possible with relatively modest stations using weak signal digital modes. Amateur satellites retransmit signals received on one frequency band onto another frequency band, functioning similarly to repeaters in space, but over much greater distances than terrestrial repeaters. Some satellites require high-gain antennas that have to track the satellite in azimuth and elevation. Operators may have to compensate uplink and downlink frequencies to compensate for Doppler shift. Do not use more power on or antenna gain that is necessary to avoid inconveniencing others. That's very important when you work with satellites. Link budget calculations can be done by calculating free space path loss or using a propagation forecasting tool. The calculations take into account transmitter power, antenna gains and losses, receiver sensitivity, antenna gain and losses, and other factors like polarization loss. The link margin provides an indication of how robust the link will be, what power is required, what antennas are required, and what the reliability of a link is likely to be. So I've here on the screen the questions, the review questions, which are on page 261. So I think if everybody put on the unmute their microphones and participate. And let's see the first question. And this question, there are different ways of approaching it. So let's see what you think about it. What is a transmission path of a wave that travels directly from the transmitting antenna to the receiving antenna called? So I just want to, before we proceed, if we look at C and D, that the linear wave and the plane wave is more concerned with wave front geometry. So that's not got nothing to do with transmission path. So just look at 1A and 1B. So I'm going to read you something here. The ground wave follows the curvature of the Earth, as we said. And the sky wave is reflected off the ionosphere back to Earth. That's on page 254. Now I've just got another definition here. The direct wave travels in a straight, unobstructed line between antennas. So now what would you say? Is it the ground wave, sky wave, or a direct wave, which is not here? And I'd like to put it open for discussion. 2 minutes. Let's just think about it, because I got the definition here of direct wave. And this might be a bit confusing, but look at 1A and 1B and think about what I said about the direct wave which travels in a straight, unobstructed line between two antennas. Now, if you look at the question again, what is the transmission path of the wave that travels directly? So that directly can also mean unobstructed, from the transmitting antenna to the receiving antenna. What are your thoughts about it? Hello?
I think it's a sky wave because it's direct.
Just look again.
I would say ground wave.
Okay. Ground wave. Okay, just go and look at the definition of a sky wave again. Page 254. I'll just go there and I'll read it again to you. Where is sky wave now? Yeah, sky wave, that's basic ionospheric propagation.
So it's not direct.
It's up and down.
So up and down, yeah. But now
Ground wave kind of follow the Earth, so that yeah, kind of straight.
I agree with you there. I agree with you with the ground wave, but also think about the direct wave. Now, the direct wave travels in a straight line, straight, unobstructed line between two antennas. So, okay. Yeah, so the best one is the ground wave, but do not consider also, keep that in the back of your mind, what the direct wave is. This can be tricky. So it can be either ground or a direct wave, yeah. Right, so let me see, I put it there. Right, next one. What does tropospheric bending, what effect does tropospheric bending have on 2 meter waves? A, it increases this distance over which they can be transmitted. Decrease the distance, it tends to garble phone transmissions. it reverses the sideband of phone transmissions. Let's look at tropospheric bending. Okay, let me read for you here on the bottom of page 257. Some bending or refraction of VHF and UHF radio waves occurs in the troposphere, which increases the radio horizon, and also that means the distance over which radio waves can propagate without reflection or scattering. So what would you... Shall I read it again, or you? Are you there? Hallo?
Ja, ek is hier so, Louis, jy's nog lewendig, so...
Okay. Okay. Ryan? Anders?
Ryan is nogal tricky.
Okay, so let me read again page 257. Okay, tropospheric bending, scatter and ducting. Some bending or refraction of VHF and UHF. Yeah, 2 meter radio waves is VHF. Some bending or refraction of VHF radio waves occurs in the troposphere, which increases the radio horizon, and that's the distance over which radio waves can propagate without being reflected or scattering.
So it increases the distance.
That's correct, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so go look on the bottom of page 257, and then you'll see the, if you read that one or two, three times, you'll see what it means. Yeah. Right, question 3. 2 stations 5 kilometers apart are most likely to be communicating via tropospheric waves, ionospheric waves, direct waves, or ground waves.
Direct waves. 5K is not far.
No. As I said, with the walkie-talkies, or what do you call it, the mobile handheld
Yeah.
radios.
Yeah.
So
direct communication.
Yeah, but you don't see the other guy. There might be.
Does it really refract off the troposphere or the ionosphere? I don't think so.
No. There's no refraction there.
So direct.
You're standing on the ground, maybe.
Ground waves.
Ground waves, yeah. Okay. Okay, question 4. The D layer occurs in the ionosphere at a height of about 80, 150, 200, and 300 kilometers. So I don't expect you to remember the figures now, so I'm going to just read it to you. Page 253, if you want to go there. 253. Right. The D layer, so it says the ionosphere is divided into 4 layers. The D layer, which extends from 50 to 90 kilometers above the surface. So 50 to 90, yeah. Right, the F2 layer occurs at a height of 80, 150, 100 to 120, 200. You see 150 and 100 to 200. Okay, let's look on page 254.
On your slides that you showed us, it actually said 220 to 800, wasn't it? Oh no, that was the F. Yeah, it is the F2. We're talking about the F2. You said 220, but when you were talking, you said 180.
Yeah, I think I've got 2. Well, that's more or less in the middle of that. Let's stick to what the my figure was. It based on that figure?
So then, based on this, it will be 5C.
But now, if you look at the one let's see. But look at B also. It can also be right. Let me just check in the text here, 254, and we're looking at the F2 layer. The questions
You
are
say
not
it's
always
fluctuating.
Extends from 150 to 180 kilometers. F2, and then I selected 150. But 100 to 200 can also be right. You see what I mean? 150 can be right. 150 to 200, to 180. It says here in the text, 150 to 180. So for that reason, I selected 150. But this is open to your own interpretation, and there you might lose a point if your interpretation and that of the examiner differs. So that's why I selected 150. Okay, but you make your own opinion on that one. All right. I can just squeeze around. There we go. Right, let's go to question 6. The ionospheric layer that mostly reflects long-distance communication is the D, E, F1 or F2 layer.
F2?
Yeah, you're right. Let me just mark it here. It says here in the text, refraction by the F2 layer, and in the night, the single F layer is responsible for most long-distance HF communication. So the F2 is right. Right, signals above the MUF, the maximum usable frequency passing through the F2 layer, are reflected to Earth, pass through and are lost in space, are amplified and are attenuated and reflected.
To pass through and lost into space.
Space, that's correct. Yeah. Right, next one. A VH station finds a propagation opening on 2 meters that lasts for an hour with contacts of around 1,500 kilometers. The opening is most likely caused by sporadic E, tropospheric scatter, ionospheric refraction in the F layer, or meteoscatter. Page 257, we just read here.
I wonder if it's not that late afternoon towards the west, and then you get the tropospheric scatter.
Tropospheric. Tropospheric. I think I might be wrong here. I put sporadic E, but let's look at it. Sporadic E. Let's look at the 2 different options. Right, I'll read to you sporadic E. A form of ionospheric propagation that affects VHF transmission is known as sporadic E. This propagation modes consist of the refraction of VHF frequency from small patches of intense ionization in the E layer. The cause of these intensely ionized area is not well understood. Let me just see. Sporadic E most frequently occurs during summer daylight hours and may last several hours. That's why I thought about that.
And this one is only 1 hour.
Yeah. And then what did you also say? Tropospheric? Scatter, no?
Yeah.
Okay, as I said with the previous question, some bedding radio occurs in the troposphere, which increases the radio horizon. That's transmitted over long areas. They don't say anything about time here. I think that might be a reason why I selected sporadic E. Is daar Henry of Johannes, het julle kommentaar daarso? Is ons reg of is ons verkeerd hier?
Ek is te lief om daai vraag te vra voor.
Gemene vraag hierdie.
Louis, ek is besig om die online goeders te edit. By watse vraag is julle nou?
Vraag 8. Ekskuus, nee, is reg. Ek het gedink aan sporadic jy sou met hulle tyd ding dan gegee. Dit kan 'n uur of meer wees. See, I don't have the answers. I also figured it out myself. Okay, let's leave that one for now. Gaan dink so 'n bietjie oor daai een. And then we'll have a discussion again on that. I don't want to waste too much time. Right, number 9, meteoscatter, QSOs often use SSB or use very short pulses of propagation, are only possible in the summer, are common on the lower HF bands. So I'm going to read for you, but we haven't read it anyway, so let me read it. Okay, meteoscatter, meteors entering the Earth's atmosphere leave a trail of ionized gas in their path that can refract VHF signals. The ionization typically only lasts for a few seconds or tens of seconds before the electrons and the ions recombine. Very fast speech or Morse code or specialized digital modes is needed to take advantage of meteoscatter. A typical meteoscatter bands are 6 meters and 2 meters. So what would you say, A, B, C, or D?
I would say B.
B, okay, I agree with you there. We might be both right or we might be both wrong, but I agree with you there. But go through these questions again. Go read up where you think is necessary. Go to back to the text. And if you have any differences, when we see each other again, maybe at the flea market, then I'll bring my book along and then we can have a chat there. EME communications are accessible to superstations using massive antennas and high power. B, all VHF stations. C, relatively modest stations using computer-based weak signal modes. Or then A and C.
Yes. It's number D, I think.
Yes, A and C, yeah.
A and C, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. I have to admit it's A and C.
A and C, and A and C. Right, let's look at the last 3. Satellite frequencies change while monitoring the satellite signal. Sorry?
Can you change that previous one, just the order of them so that we can say it's D and A?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Right. Satellite frequencies change while monitoring the satellite signals during its path. This change is due to
Doppler.
Doppler, yeah. Well, I think we all know Doppler.
Frequency shift. Yeah.
Right. Question 12. Both azimuth and elevation refer to satellite ground station antenna positions, mobile communications, maritime, or Doppler direction finding.
Must be A.
A, yeah, you're correct. Right. This one, I didn't see the word transponder in the text. Satellites that contain transponders which relay only CW signals, only FM, or all modes of modulation or digital signals only. What did you say on that one? I think satellites can basically handle any
modulation, yeah.
So, yeah, you're right. Yeah, see. Yeah. Right, let's look at the last questions. I just want to read you something here. And then you can answer that one. When you're working a satellite, you shoot. Right. Use the maximum power permissible, speak Esperanto, sufficient power to maintain reliable communications, use a speech processor. But let me just read you this. If you put too loud a signal into an uplink receiver, the onboard AGC will reduce this receiver sensitivity of the receiver, killing the signals for all other users. We will stand out like a sore thumb and probably spend a lot of time answering fan mail. So I think you immediately will see what the answer is.
C.
To C.
That's correct.
I remember that.
Okay. So, just want to...
Louis, ek wil dalk daarso inlas. 'n Mens gebruik altyd so min as moontlik krag, maar soveel as wat jy nodig het. So met ander woorde, jy probeer altyd minder gebruik, maar soveel soos wat jy duidelik.
Hou jou footprint so klein as moontlik is die geheim. Hou jou footprint so laag as moontlik.
Ja.
So hoeveel wat sou jy nou sê? 5 watt of minder? As jy nou met 'n satelliet gesels, Henry?
Ek dink dis meer
ek het nog nie met daardie goeders gespeel nie, maar ek weet die ouens praat van baie lae krag wat hulle gebruik.
Ja.
Ek sal 'n bietjie uitvind wat is die gemiddelde kraguitsending wat hulle gebruik, maar dis
milliwatts?
Partymal milliwatts en partymal 1 watt of so.
Ja.
So sê as ons satelliet werk en so aan ook mos. Miskien ons seker by hom hoor.
Ja.
Seker reg onthou.
Ja.
Jan Leeman.
Ek probeer onthou wat hulle daai Eutelsat se lesing gesê het, maar ek onthou dit was bitterlaag geweest, ja. As jy 10 watt daar insit, dan gaan jy jou fanmail kry natuurlik net.
Wat is daai satelliet se wat se 100, wat sy nommer?
Quebec Oscar.
Quebec Oscar 100.
Watt is vir hom. Van met 'n 75 cm dish. 22.5 dB aan antenne. Ek's nou met die amsat.uk.org wat eintlik 'n ek dit op een kant volg. Hulle het eintlik 'n web SDR wat mense kan nog gaan luister wat mense daar praat. Kan wat jy op die webbrowser kan nou luister. Maar ja, hulle gee dit hierso ook vir die uplink gee hulle dit narrowband modes like SSB or CW, 5 watt nominal uplink power in 22.5 dBi antenna gain, 75 cm dish and RHCP polarization.
Ja, ek het iets van navorsing gedoen. The sweet spot typically 1 to 5 watts.
1 to 5. Dis nou tipies hoe radioamateurs is om so min as moontlik krag te probeer gebruik om die maksimum effek te kry. Wat dit soveel meer elegant maak.
Dis daar's 'n link vir daardie wat ek nog gekyk het. As enigiemand na te wil verwys.
Okay, kom ons doen die laaste vraag. 'n link budget, ek probeer net sien. Link budget is the amount of money needed to construct a communication system, the cost of civil engineering required to establish antennas, a calculation of the transmitter and receiver parameters, antennas and path loss to evaluate the feasibility of a communication system, en dan the business model for a commercial radio station. Ek dink julle dit is so voor die hand liggend.
As by C.
C, ja.
Ja.
C, ja.
Selfs commercial gaan jy daar goed mee doen.
Ja. So lees 'n bietjie daar op bladsy 259 en 260 about die link budget. Hoe jy dit gebruik. En dit is daai Using calculation, total link can be modeled taking into account antenna gain, feeder losses, connector losses, polarization, mismatch losses en obstructions. Daai lang formule daar op bladsy 259. Okay, so dit sluit die lesing af. Is daar enige vrae wat julle het? Okay. Maar as ons mekaar weer sien, welkom, enige tyd.
Ja.
Dankie julle almal.
Dankie.
Right, ek stop die opname.
Dankie.
Okay.